Now, we are joined for the next 1 hour by an expert on these matters, a public finance management expert, economist, Wangari Muikia. She is the executive director of Expertise KE, which is a consultation, a consultants company on economics and all these matters. I'm sure you've been listening to what we're discussing, Larry.
Yes, I have. Yes, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Do you agree with what Wanjiru is saying? First of all, starting from there, we should declare our national debt a national crisis.
Well, I have maybe a more tempered view because let's start from the basics, right, Eric? The reason that we are getting into this debt situation is because we've been operating on a deficit for a long time. We create budgets. Our budgets time and time again have been unrealistic. We've not been able to meet those budgets. We then have revenue projections, and we're not able to meet those revenue projections. As you know, KRA has not been able to raise the revenues that it has been projecting for the past several years. So we end up with
that they haven't been able to raise those, or is that they raise them but they don't end up where they're supposed to end up?
Well, okay, that is also a confounding factor. But structural issues, they're never really simple. Yeah, there's always the fiscal framework, and then there's also the confounding factors when it comes with corruption. But let's get back to the debt issue, right? So we then now have this huge fiscal deficit that we want to plug. And remember, we have Big Four, we have very ambitious goals in terms of trying to achieve this vision that we have for ourselves. And we have county governments, we have a really large wage bill. We have a lot of things that we need to budget for, that we need to raise money for, that we are not able to raise money for. So enter stage left, debt. The challenge now we're having is that Kenya became a middle income country a few years ago. This had really big almost catastrophic result or effect on Kenya, because now we're not able to access concessional loans from the World Bank and IMF and other institutions like that. And now we have to actually go to the markets to borrow. And this is a strange situation for us. We've never been here. So every time you hear about Eurobond, it's a new thing. Even you open the newspaper, it's like, what is the Eurobond? People are trying to figure out where are we, what are we doing?
What's a middle income country? What is it? A middle-income economy?
A middle-income economy is an economy that raises a certain level of dollars per capita that, according to international organizations, is more sustainable going forward. And I don't have the exact figure right now, and I'm sure I can get it for you. But there are different levels. There's low-income economy, and there's middle-income economy, and then there's high-income economy.
And what are the indicators? That is the theory behind it. So, as a Kenyan, what do I need to see happening, and what do I need to feel to know that I'm in a middle-income country?
You need to be able to earn a certain level of income per day, per capita. So per capita, you should be able to access a certain amount of income or revenues to be able to run your daily living. But you see,
percentage of a population needs to be in a certain position.
The per capita, the equalizer for the country is to learn a certain level of income. But the challenge is, if I may, CT, is that the inequality in Kenya is so high that you have that when you even out and you average it, yes, it comes to a middle income state, but the reality is that there's a large portion of the population that are very low, and there's a small portion of the population that is very high. So the inequality factor, this is the problem with statistics, international statistics, that they don't capture these type of idiosyncrasies when it comes to...
They're not real to our situation.
Yeah. So when now you layer that on top of and say, okay, Kenya is a middle income country, and to some extent we do feel it. We see like the roads are being, we have the roads. The roads are being developed and things like that. We have a railway. We kind of see some things. We see healthcare.
Many international airports.
But we've never had an SGR, have we?
No, we haven't. And we haven't had such a huge debt accruing from the SGR.
Exactly. So, but listen, we need to go back. Debt inherently is not bad in and of itself. Debt can help a responsible nation to invest in infrastructure that will help it to leapfrog in terms of development to be able to provide enhanced services for its citizens. So you borrow, if you're fiscally responsible, you do borrow to invest in that infrastructure and then ensure that infrastructure then is able to repay that debt going forward. So case in point, if we're saying we're investing in the SGR, we're borrowing for the SGR, we built the SGR. The theory behind that was then we would be able to engage in much more efficient, effective, and all the whole more, larger trade in Kenya and also with the rest of Africa. And that in turn will bring more revenues.
All right, so let's throw it in there and ask the question, because it started off with if. So is Kenya fiscally responsible?
Well...
And is our debt sustainable?
Is it sustainable? Those two questions.
Okay.
Is Kenya fiscally responsible? Mm-hmm. And can we sustain this that we've entered into?
Kenya has a lot of structural challenges. We are relying on about 20% of the population to finance the whole country. People who are paying PAYE, people who are, when we pay the VAT, to a lesser extent, VAT and customs also contributes to revenues. The larger revenues come from people who are paying, you and I.
The direct tax.
Yeah, who are paying PAYE and income tax. So and like we said, I think this discussion was, Wangari said earlier, 80% of the economy is informal. What does that mean? 80% of the people who are employed in the informal sector are not paying PAYE. So structurally, that is not sustainable. You cannot have 20% of the country sustaining the rest of the whole 100% of the country.
But that statement is not really entirely true, because if you are saying that the only measure that seems to lend itself to an equitable contribution to tax payment is pay as you earn, then are we not ignoring the indirect taxes that every Kenyan pays, whether they like it or not, through foodstuffs or costs that are passed down because of fuel levy and things like that? So I would argue that there's no Kenyan who actually escapes from paying taxes.
Yes, but you see, you as a Kenyan who is paying PAYE, you are paying that consumption tax and also paying the other tax.
Yes, I am.
So that's where the 20% comes in her argument.
Right,
And
but the
that
question...
everybody else is paying tax, yes, but the consumption tax. But then there are people who are paying higher, significantly higher.
And
right,
the percentage...
but the question that we were asking is, are we in a debt crisis? Because of these very factors that you're saying, the fact that we have irresponsible borrowing, high inequality, expenditure priorities that are, quite imprudent. So, yes, debt is good. We've procured a large amount of debt. We are borrowing. Right now, we are doing high concessionary and, in fact, even local borrowing at very expensive terms to pay off the interest of the debt. Is that not what a crisis looks like? I believe there are even considerations to rebase the economy once again.
So what's happening is that debt is around, from last I saw, it's about 60% of GDP, which is also another question for another day. I don't know why we measure debt by GDP, but that's some basic things that we also need to discuss, yeah. But it's about 60% of GDP. Our band that we set for ourselves as Kenyans is it shouldn't go higher than 50%, but the absolute maximum it could go, if it does go over 50%, is 70%. Right now we're at 60%. So if we base that, if we look at just the framework that we've set for ourselves, then we're not in a crisis. But the other question is, how fast have we gone over 50%, and how fast are we approaching now the 70%? And that is now when you called me here and you said the ballooning debt, then that's where I would agree. It's ballooning very quickly. If we don't tame it, if we don't borrow for borrowing's sake, right? We need to borrow and then essentially have the structure through which we can then repay that debt. If we're not putting that structure in place, if we are not widening the tax base, if we're not getting rid of exemptions, if we're not making sure the county governments are raising the potential that they have in revenue, then we will continue to have these problems and
Now
we'll
you
become
see
like
your
Greece.
ifs, all those ifs, there's an answer. We are not.
Yes,
So are we in a crisis?
And also, Wangari, when you talk about the 60%, that's before computing the debt held by state-owned enterprises and the rolling stock. And the argument is if that is computed, we'll
surpass it very
we'll
quickly.
surpass it. And the debt ceiling, I think, took us to about 100. Would take us to 100%, or does it take us to 70%?
Well, right now the debt ceiling would take us to about 100%. So
and their argument that if we computed what government has not factored in to the debt in terms of this rolling debt stock and in terms of the state-owned enterprises debt, if that was factored in, the argument is that it will get up to near 100%. So we are in a crisis. It's just that it doesn't look like a crisis because government has not declared.
So I think we've not... to the extent that the parastatals are also holding debt, there are also parastatals that are also holding a lot of excess cash. The challenge that we have, and we are doing this big project with the National Treasury at the moment, is that we don't have an eye on this debt, and we don't have an eye on these excess reserves that these parastatals have. We are in a case where sometimes the government is going outside of the country and even going into domestic borrowing when the money is actually sitting in some big parastatals and they're not being used. So it's like we are borrowing and then we're going back to the people that we have given money, the parastatals that are holding excess reserves. Those parastatals are then lending to the government because they have excess reserves, right? So it's a really bad situation where, let's say, Ojira, I give you money and then I don't have any money and then I give you a loan, or I give you a loan and then now you're able to access debt from you're able to access resources from me with the money that I gave you. So it's a really untenable situation. So I would go back and say the fundamentals are not strong for the economy. We haven't, in the sense that we haven't reached the kind of alarm point of 70% is the compounding factor that says it's not a crisis, but the fact that we are going there quick and we have not really investigated or interrogated the fiscal fundamentals thoroughly and completely, that's where we have the problem going forward.
Are these indicators sufficient? I mean, really? Because according to, like you say, the IMF indicators, we are in a moderate risk, at a moderate risk level. But, and for Treasury, that's not a bad statement because they want to be able to borrow more. But as a country and for Parliament, are these indicators really sufficient?
But what are the other indicators you should look at? If you're talking about a country where even as the few who are considered to be extremely wealthy increase, those who are considered to be extremely poor also increase. Now, these are the sort of economic situations that bring about instability. Now, if you have a situation where you have social instability, the economy of necessity will suffer. Now, if once again the debt that we speak of is owed more to people outside entities like foreign governments or foreign banks, and then with ours it's compounded where even the public, a lot of them, the debt is also owed by the public. Now, what you have is, as they've absorbed our liquidity. So what do you have? A situation where the sort of activity that is required to keep an economy moving is actually being hampered by the same government who want to claim by the statements they make that they are working towards growing the economy. And then their actions are stifling the economy. What do you say, my dear?
Well, some of the fundamentals, if you look at how we measure debt, that is also a big, it doesn't really make sense. If you say debt to GDP, GDP in and of itself is a statistical measure that is not complete. We leave a lot out of GDP.
Especially if you look at the Western concept with a situation like Kenyans, there's a lot they don't even consider.
Yeah. So what a better measure I would put forth is we should look at debt to revenue, right? So because that's what we use to finance our debt. So if we look at our debt to revenue ratio, the last I read from a report from the IMF in January, we were at around 40%. Essentially 40% of our revenues is being used to pay our debt. That leaves only 60% to finance everything that we have in the budget, which means we're looking at, salaries, we're looking at the recurrent budget, we're looking at the big four, we're looking at all these things. And already we don't even have enough revenues in the first place, right? So it really becomes a challenge, I think, when it comes to thinking about this. The exposure to foreign, because we're borrowing internationally, commercial loans are expensive. It's denominated in dollars or euros or whatever it is. And so it leaves us exposed to foreign volatility as opposed to holding it in country.
You can never actually fully pay because the moment there's a fluctuation in the currency, you're actually back where you started.
And you see, this is why Japan is able to manage its debt. I heard that a discussion about Japan happened earlier. Japan's debt is denominated in yen mostly.
Yes, it is.
And their debt to revenue ratio is about 5%, which means 95% of their revenues goes back to the country, and they're able to invest.
And develop,
not like
absolutely.
us. Yeah.
Take a short break. This is a situation with 17 minutes past 9 o'clock. We have in the studio with us an economist, Wangari Muikia. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Expertise Global Consulting. We are talking about a national debt. Remember, this is what our guest host this morning, when Jiro Gekonyo had raised and said we should declare national debt a national crisis. The question that you need to answer now directly, yes or no, crisis or not?
Before you answer that question,
Thank you, because I don't have a straight answer for that.
Is such a gentleman.
So I got you.
what would you say is the nature of the debt that we have to pay on a yearly basis? How much is it?
Well, currently it stands around 6 trillion. Part of it is commercial loan, part commercially denominated debt. Then we have we have concessional, which I think the last I saw, the actual figures I saw, I think it was in 2018. It was about half and half. But that has, we've gone through the Eurobond. We're now going again to the market. So that I think has increased. Now, if we have a larger percentage, which we do now, of commercial borrowing, then we are paying a lot of
It's a huge amount.
of interest.
Oxfam and the Kenya Institute of Economic Affairs put us third after Angola and Ethiopia. These aren't supposed to be good statistics. Okay? Ethiopia is doing okay. Angola has been heading in the direction of a failed state. Not quite there, but they're also not us. So how do you call us what is it called? Middle income country?
And all have
Moderate
resources.
risk.
Moderate
Well,
risk.
if you look at other countries like South Sudan, 100% debt to GDP, Cape Verde, Mozambique, those guys are overstretched when it comes to borrowing. And then on top of that, they don't have the fiscal fundamentals to backstop it. Japan does, other countries, US does. But other countries like this, they're not able to.
Are you saying we have the fiscal
No,
fundamentals?
and that's what I was saying before. We don't have the fiscal fundamentals, and
giving
the ballooning
extreme
debt is now
examples.
starting to get there. Yeah.
Right. And then when we talk about the fiscal fundamentals, the ability to raise this revenue, where is this money going to come from? Because we've talked about the inequality. We've talked about the heavy dependency on the pay-as-you-earn. We also know that indirect tax, when you broaden the base, and you broaden the base, you've got the turnover tax, you've got the presumptive tax, you've got excise duty, you've got VAT, all falling on, in an unequal, in a situation of inequality, falling on the shoulders of the very poor. Then from a human rights perspective, you are then taxing people who aren't able to pay. So, we need to broaden the base. But is the problem not that we have borrowed without anticipating how to repay, and now as a knee-jerk solution, we are then saying, let's broaden the base, let's get the money from the most poor who can't. So for me, I think we're in a kind of
tailspin.
Yes.
I don't think because this plan to widen the tax base has been there for a long time. The debt is kind of like the new kid on the block, and that has also been a challenge because National Treasury has not had a well-functioning public debt management office. We've had a lot of people come and go to managing that office, and even the reporting around budgeting has been unclear. So debt has had some challenges, and what has confounded it is when you become middle income, and now we're starting to borrow externally. But the KRA has always had the challenge of not being able to access the tax base. And the when it comes to turnover tax, it comes to presumptive tax, this is the effort to capture more of the informal businesses, or the small businesses that are earning at least, I think it's 5 million shillings in turnover for the turnover tax, to contribute to paying taxes. Now, I do think that there should be some sort of consideration and some sort of banding where you have, yes, you're earning 5 million, but if you're earning less than a certain amount, then you should be exempt. And so I think that would be a more realistic way of doing things. But on the other side, sorry, Siti, if I could just say one more thing, is that the exemptions that the KRA is giving to many big, high-earning institutions are too much. We're talking about to the extent of 500 billion shillings in exemptions. So, and this was something that was recorded about 2017.
In this country?
Yes, in exemptions.
That's where the
and then we look at the deficit, and then we look at KRA is not able to reach their target. The target they're missing by is about 300 billion. So on one hand, you're exempting 500 billion, and then you fall short on 300 billion. So,
Wangari,
guys,
what you're saying is that they're giving exemptions, and then they're going back to the poorest
and
taxing them.
No, I would
So
pause.
this is the issue of our campaign.
And the human rights.
Is
and
this
all,
one?
and all.
The exemption.
So like I said, and my underlying theory from the beginning was the fundamentals and the structure is not right. We need to fix this structure to be able to respond to what is happening.
It's not right. It sounds different from it's wrong.
Yes.
So let's just say our fundamentals are wrong. Senor,
You can say that.
it sounds.
Me, I'll say it in economic language. It is not
you're an
correct.
economist.
I think Wangari will co-opt you as an advisor because you have just given us our public education
That is
message.
needed, absolutely.
That is very straighthtforard.
Now, if you look at the
Because
public
the
finance
IMF,
management reform,
the
they're
IMF
thinking about that.
IMF, sorry, just before you. IMF, when, according to the media, the IMF and Treasury are concerned about the 300B deficit. And the proposal was then to get that from reintroducing VAT on the VAT exempt basic goods because it would net the 300B. And in fact, that article said that the IMF is very concerned about this exemption that was put on these goods. Now, when you come here and you tell us that there is actually 500B in exemptions,
That
and we know
somebody
a
could be
recent
paying.
one, stamp duty on the merger of NIC and CBA, both my banks, right? But that exemption is odious because that's part of these, the revenue shortfalls.
So if you look at the public finance management reform strategy that the country, I think we're in the third phase right now, and I was part of those negotiations, is that part of resolving this issue was, one, to bring more of the informal economy onto the become tax paying, to become formalized, at least in that sense, but also to make sure that exemptions are reduced. Now, the turnover tax and the presumptive tax have been able to come on board from this reform, but it's much harder to get these exemptions because it's harder in the sense that it's shrouded in secrecy, it's opaque, nobody knows who is being given what, and nobody wants. Of course, if you're being given a tax break, you're not going to go and say, sir, I've been given a tax break, I would like to rectify. Of course not. So the kind of the low-hanging fruit has been to go for the informal reform first, but it's not to say we're saying doing that instead of going for the tax exemptions. It's also in addition. But the tax exemption situation, there are a lot of,
it seems
hands in the batter that make it difficult to
So in theory, we're
implement.
doing both, but in practice, it's going for the easier one. The low-lying fruit is the easier one.
Well, that's how reform works. You try to reform and you do the one that you can do first, and then as you try to figure out the other. But of course, us on the ground, we don't know that. We just know that CG turnover tax has come and presumptive tax has come, yet CG, these big firms are still enjoying tax exemptions. So
it's clear then, though, that would be the thing. Because again, we say that if people have a fundamental understanding of what is really happening, then it lends credence to the fact that they would then actually be able to open their mouths and say, this is what we realize actually is the situation on the ground. And this then is how we can solve it. Because we've talked about it not being right, it being wrong. At the end of the day, it is not things are not okay.
I'm
And we see very clearly that we see how people then can enter into this conversation and try and make a change in terms of what is going on, because it cannot continue like this. And if we look at the money that has been borrowed recently, if we look at the last 12 months, we're borrowing money to pay loans. We're not borrowing money to develop the country.
I'm still puzzled.
This is a problem.
These corporations that were given exemptions, was there a specific or special reason? Because I'm sure care is not illogical. What was the thinking? I hope so. What was the thinking
capture.
behind?
State capture.
Well, I wish I could answer that, or I wish I knew who these people being given exemptions were. It really is a big black box. We only know this because it was an estimation given to us by the IMF, and the IMF are privy to some of the information that is provided by Central Bank and the National Treasury. So they're able to make these estimations. But for the rest of us, and the rest of us who are trying to grapple with this issue, it really is a big black box. We don't know who's been giving these exemptions.
So, Wangari, you're talking about, from a point of view of access to information or transparency, Article 35, and in fact, Article 201, because the budget must be transparent, there is information we don't have. IMF has it by virtue of their position. And so when we talk about our first step being declare, and then let us know what is there. Transparency is a big issue. But then from a tax justice point of view as well, informal traders don't have access. The tax justice presupposes that government is giving you a service for the tax that they are demanding. What is government giving informal traders exactly? Because a lot of them don't have trading spaces, don't have access to services. They not only don't have a trading space, they pay for their garbage, they pay for their water, they pay for everything. Right? And then they're taxed.
Yeah. Well, Jira, we've come a long way. And when you start quoting those sections of the Constitution, I remember that we were together when we started doing this whole devolution debate. We've come a long way. And I really appreciate it when I talk to you about these things. Transparency is a huge issue when it comes to Kenya. Even people understanding the right for them to ask for data when it comes to budget, when it comes to revenue. That's still not something that an everyday person realizes that it's a right to have that information. And even if they have that information, what are they going to do with it? Do they have the capacity to understand what is in a budget? Do they have, I'm an economist. I've studied these things. I've looked at budgets until my eyes are bleeding. But sometimes I look at these things and I'm like, I have no idea what you're doing this thing here. It's really complicated. So if I give it to my mom, not that my mom is not educated, my mom is well educated, she won't understand it because she's not an economist, I feel sorry, or I feel stressed for people if I give it to a mama mbogo, if I give it to a small trader. How is she going to, even if I give it to her, she's not going to be able to participate in public.
Small bits that are easy to consume.
In morsels.
But that assumes that the people are doing that. There's no requirement in the law that says break it down for people. It just says provide the information.
Breaking down things in this country doesn't work, see?
Here we go.
Actually, it does work.
Our Katiba has never been broken down. Our BBI has not been broken down.
Who's our?
This is broken
BBI is
down.
not ours. BBI is some of you's.
It doesn't actually.
It's ours, Wajiro. You pay for it.
It's not promulgated.
You pay for it. You own it.
IMF's in town, Wangari. Negotiations are going on for a special facility for the country. What's that about? What demands should we be making of government of Kenya in this process? And then really, what's the role of citizens around this?
Well, the IMF, they're in town, and usually when they come in town, their first point of, I guess the first point they visit is the central bank. And so IMF are mostly concerned about the macroeconomic context of the country. Are we, what's the situation of our lending, our banks, our stock markets, our, the whole macro fiscal context. So they are coming to assess whether, every year they come and they provide some, areas for improvement, some recommendations, and they come back and they say, well, have you been able to achieve those, what we've recommended? Have you implemented them? What's going wrong this time? What's going right? And so them in town is kind of like almost like an audit, an external audit, but also less an audit, but more a capacity building, hand-holding visit or mission in town. So what do we expect? We expect for them to be an objective external eye into what's happening in our economy, if the most of us, whatever we read from CBK or we read, by the way, the central CBK governor is always tweeting. Yeah, I find his tweets are very interesting, very entertaining. But just if we're not trusting of what the CBK is telling us, then we have an external party to say, well, the CBK is saying this, but we think this, or we agree with this, and that going on. So I think for us who are in the macroeconomic space, who deal with this kind of fiscal framework context, it's very interesting for us to understand whether the fundamentals are right, whether we're going in the right direction, an objective external eye.
Right.
So now the public, based on the information that we get from the IMF, then can be able to temper, and say, well, are we in a good space or are we in a bad space? Is business going to be able to grow? Is the central bank providing and the national government providing a context or environment for us to be able to continue growing? Are we in a good place? Are we in a bad place? So it's kind of an objective external eye, so that we can kind of eke out the truth somehow, since everything is not is opaque.
Right? Guys, let me go to the phone lines. Alan is calling in from Nairobi. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning.
Hello, Alan.
Yeah, the first point I want to make
Yes.
is let's not lock ourselves on that exemptions issue.
Mm-hmm.
That exemptions debate has been around for many years, and those exemptions come about because of projects like SGR or projects with loans funded. That's how you get those exemptions. But it is not the problem we're having. Our problem is that the economy is not growing and we're not collecting enough taxes. Now, my second point, do we have a debt crisis? We do. If you want to find out that, go and look at our external debt register. Today, it's even on the net.
Mm-hmm.
We are forever borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. And where the rubber meets the road is debt to revenues. Forget about those things of IMF, of debt sustainability studies and debt to GDP. Mm-hmm. It's like arguing that I'm right because I have a piece of land in Homer Bay, which costs this, and you put it in your balance sheet, yet you can't pay school fees.
Mm. It's true.
Yeah?
It's so true.
We have a big problem. That's today they are saying we are going to the market in a couple of weeks or next month to borrow something that they're calling a green Eurobond. The problem, Rwanda went to the market to borrow a Eurobond. The money was ring-fenced to build an international conference center. Mm-hmm. It was not us, we borrow, we call it budget support, and we spend it. Now, the last point, very last point.
Yes.
You have done a good job at analyzing the state of debt. Now we need to reach a point when we're saying, how do we get out of it?
Right.
My suggestion is the following. There's this new concept brought by UNCTAD called odious debt, which is if you find debt that was used for corruption, Aror Dam, yeah? Mm-hmm. If you use debt, then you stick it to this regime. If you look at, you see the one of medical services from China, SGR, all those debts should belong to Uhuru and the DP. And this is what UNCTAD is calling odious debt. Thank you.
Say it again, Alan. Thank you.
Okech in Kisumu. Good morning, Okech.
Good morning, Spice FM.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I had a contribution. I wish to say that I think there is an extent by which the cost of living relates to the national debt. And I think that we must not wait for the ratio to get to 70%. I think any increase in percentage implies something to how we live, the cost of living.
Yep.
So I think we must not necessarily wait until it is 70 or 80 or 90 so that we declare it a crisis. It is a crisis already. And something else I would wish to add is that the composition of our governance, as it is presently constituted, does not show any willingness to sort this issue. I think it depends on we, the commoners, you and me, so that we solve it out. You can very well recall when Raila Odinga wanted power from Uhuru Kenyatta, which he was very hesitant to yield, he mobilized the people, and the people would go to demonstrate every Monday, and somehow it yielded results. According to me, the public ought to wake up. I think we have views and opinions about these things, but all we do is tweet about them. And I also believe that there are various frameworks, checks and balances, which ensures that these things are done transparently and in the right way. Now, we will not continue relying on court orders because we have seen instances, and I think there are so many, that the government does not intend to take court orders.
Right.
When one of us is exiled and there's a court order about it, we go back to Twitter and tweet. When the currencies were given with a portrait of a president, all we could say is that we have no problem with the money. It's not about the money, it is about the rule of law.
Right. Thank you very much,
so
okay.
I think
Asante sana and have a good day. 0719-012-600. It's a contribution that would like you to have on this particular conversation. So your reactions to those two phone calls?
So the gentleman mentioned that we shouldn't worry about exemptions because it's been happening for a long time. I would beg to differ. It's been happening for a long time, and this is why we're here now. We need to rectify it. We can't just say, imefanyika. No, that's not going to happen. That is why we're here today.
He's saying some of it is also pegged on the kind of borrowing that we've made.
Yes, exactly, and that's what we were talking about. If you get into commercial borrowing, but you see now SGR was some of this thing is government to government, right?
Yep.
And government to government actually is not even on the books. Right, these government-to-government special contracts are not on the books. We have no eye towards them, to what's happening on these arrangements between China and Kenya. Which is why we always keep saying, can't you share this information with us?
Before you go on, shouldn't there be an eye as to what really, because we talked about transparency and looking at what really is the state. Because with people, because if people are ignorant, it's not necessarily my choice, because in this point, the information is not being shared. Shouldn't it be? Shouldn't there be an eye?
Definitely. It should definitely be shared, but nobody's really... There's no requirement. You always see in the paper, you need to share. But where is the actual impetus? Where does the rubber hit the road? Where do you require and make these people share? Sometimes we have legislation. We are a country full of beautiful laws, but we implement some and stick by them thoroughly, and others were just like, it was in this clause, and you kind of forget, you kind of brush it under the rug. So the rule of law, of course, I think is very wanting.
Can we actually get out of debt?
I think we can. I think if we have good leaders who are making sure that we are getting into have a good fiscal framework and getting it to positive debt that is manageable, debt that will invest in infrastructure or whatever it is that will help repay back that debt. Because, the other thing is we're borrowing, but you think we're not the ones paying? There are children, and their children's children are going to be the ones paying. Now, if we're making an investment that's saying this infrastructure is going to help our children's children pay for this debt, then we're getting somewhere there. But if we're getting into just debt that's paying for salaries, that's paying for recurrent expenditures that doesn't generate additional revenue, then we're in big problems. And we're seeing some effect of that's happening in Kenya, where that debt is actually going to finance recurrent expenditure, salaries. We have a huge wage bill for operations and maintenance, and this is where the big challenge lies.
Do you know any situation in Kenya where bad debt has been turned into a good debt?
Individually? Well, when I borrowed, I wouldn't be able to say. I think Kenya does have a framework to do it. We just need to make sure that the fiscal fundamentals, I keep going back to that our taxes are well thought out, that we have reliable budgets, that we're able to invest debt properly in development rather than in recurrent. If we have those fundamentals correct, then we can say, yes, we're going in the right direction. That's the same, we talked about Japan earlier. Japan, they are, how many... Is it 300? I don't know what the figure was, percent debt to GDP. But they have very strong economies. They have a huge industrial economy that they're able to repay on their debt. So, the fiscal fundamentals really matter.
Wangari, we hear you. You're talking about good leadership and fiscal fundamentals.
A lot of
we
ifs.
hear you. We hear what you can't say. Good leadership, fiscal fundamentals. That's what we need. My question is around pensions. This has emerged as a big issue in terms of in terms of a big budgetary item, and pensions seem to be growing. What can be done? Because we're asking what can be done about debt. So maybe in terms of solutions, what does the government need to do to deal with the pressure coming from pensions, which is contributing to the the demands on revenue as opposed to service delivery.
I think growing pensions is a big concern. But if you allow me to compare possibly what's happening in Kenya and other countries, so I keep going back to Japan because we had done some work looking at the state of Japan. Japan, they have an aging population. They have no young people there. Practically no young people. If you look at their demographic chart, it's wide at the top where you have very old people, and then it's really thin at the bottom where you have young people. So they have a burgeoning pension bill, but nobody to repay it. Us, on the other hand, we have a burgeoning pension bill, but we have a strong young network to finance it.
Yep.
Challenge is, are we resourcing our younger population to be able to get to contribute to the economy by having businesses, by
Jobs.
And jobs and things like that will help to backstop the growing pension challenge that we're having in the country.
So in other words, our development priorities are misaligned.
We are putting all of our eggs in one basket. The Big Four is an important vision for ourselves. But if we put all our resources and all our debt borrowing and everything in that, and leave unemployment, we leave job creation, access to credit alone, then it's really imbalanced.
We should thank God we have eggs.
There've been proposals. Under the present budget to definance or deprioritize the Big Four agenda because government has to make trade-offs in terms of budget priorities. What would you say to that?
I would say they're good. There are 4 pillars. Manufacturing is where the low-hanging fruit lies because that's where we can have a little bit more quick turnaround. Things like food security, universal health care, and I forget what
Housing.
the other, and housing may be longer-term investments, but that may not immediately they don't have a direct effect on the economy, but they have indirect effect in the fact that, you have a young, healthy population that's food secure and have housing.
And the Situation Room this morning is Wangari Muikia. She is an economist from Expertise Global Consulting. Then we have Peter, who's now on the line in Nairobi. Peter, good morning.
Yes, Eric, how are you?
We're fine, thank you.
Now, Eric,
Yes.
for Kenyans don't understand one thing. I just want to contribute this. Borrowing is not a mistake. Every time we borrow, Kenyans think it's a mistake. The economic is telling us we are at 60%. For us to do all these things that people see us doing until we come to a level where we are called a middle income country, we must borrow. As long as our figures, we are not above 70. Me, I don't see any problem. I don't know where people think this first world to where it is, or country like South Korea. It is you borrow and you invest. When you do this, you come to where other people are. Can you imagine right now, Mr. Eric, we are doing 100% transition to primary school, to secondary school. We need all these things to we need money to do all these things. We are a third world country. We must borrow. I do not have a problem with borrowing. As long as it is not above 70 or 5%. I'm hearing even somebody saying that we should go to the streets with placards to bring problem about borrowing.
Yes.
Where will you get the figures which even the economists in the studio that they even have? What
Peter,
do you go and tell people? Yes.
Peter, so yes, you don't have a problem with borrowing, and I think we all agree.
And
Nobody
he's
has
not
a
coming
problem
to the
with
streets.
borrowing. Do you have a problem with the management of the money that has been borrowed?
Exactly. That's a very good question. The goodness is, when this money came so much, there was a lot of corruption. But I'm very happy that right now, there is so much being done about corruption. You see, even in a church when there's a lot of sadaka, you see a lot of sin in that church.
These things you
These
say
things
that are being
done
done.
about corruption, where are they?
No, right now you can see something being done about corruption. It's not like that kind of
Something like?
government.
Something like?
People are being
Like
you see the
rotating
people
courts.
financing out. Rotating out.
One,
Many
two.
people are out of their job. Yeah, you cannot compare right now at the time of Moi. We can see something. You look at what Kinoti is doing. We can see something.
There's
Kenya
movement.
makes a lot of noise, even when their country is doing well.
Oh, brother, we are doing badly. We are limping. we are on crutches.
Peter
Oh,
is comfortable. Peter and
Peter,
We're not
do
doing
you live in this country?
Peter and the people he knows is
We are not doing bad. You have Kenyans have a lot
oh.
of noise. A lot of noise where you can't even sometimes you can't even see where the noise is.
Wow, okay.
Yes, we make a lot of. I have read. You can look at countries like America. Read the history of America from 1700 to where they are right now. They go through these things to be where they are right now. We
They
must
borrowed.
borrow. Yes.
But borrowing, I agree, Peter, is good. But when you say we are doing well as a country, what do you mean?
I mean, for example, look at people in Ethiopia coming to do KCP in Kenya. Yes. Well, compare yourself with the countries around you. Just compare yourself. Are we doing bad?
We are doing horribly.
It depends on
Why are you
what
being called?
compare.
Right now, Kenya is ranking number 3 after South Africa and Nigeria. Are you doing like countries like Somalia?
No, we are
Why
not.
don't you appreciate what you are doing? Why do you make so much noise sometimes on borrowing when you are at 60%? I'm very happy you have an economist in the studio. Only this discussion only makes sense when an economist comes into play, and I'm very happy what you've done for that.
Right.
But when you leave Kenya to just talk without an economist, they just talk their own thing.
Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now, Wangari, the economist, at this point,
Yes.
because I think we've kind of danced around this over and over again, with the current state of things, where are we? Are we in a good place or a bad place? The way in which we're looking at it now.
Honestly speaking.
I mean, as it is.
I mean, I'll say it again the way I said it before. I think where I would say where our crisis is if we pass where the limits that we put for ourselves. Our limit that we put ourselves is 70. The fact that we are fast approaching that 70 should be of concern, and we should put in place measures to dial back on that, getting to that level. So I think we could be heading there if we don't fix our fiscal fundamentals now. But I wouldn't say that we're in a crisis.
There's
right
a
now.
tsunami coming.
Are you happy?
that
Are you
can
happy
prepare
with my?
yourself.
Are you happy with my response?
The percentage.
I get what
isn't
exactly you're saying.
Yeah,
You're
but
saying
the-
we are not yet at
Yeah,
crisis
but-
level.
That's my view.
But
yes.
the percentage isn't even the real issue here, is it really? Japan is at 237%. Okay? It isn't the percentage. It's the other factors that are related to our borrowing and, as you put it correctly, the management of our fiscal affairs.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
not just a percentage.
Don't we, Wangari?
Let's not get confused with this
so-
percentage.
Wangari,
so-
don't we
so-
have to look at the standards of living for the average Kenyan dropping? Don't we have to look at what is being done with this money that's actually being borrowed? Then for us to be able to translate and say where we are on this thermometer of good or bad. Really, don't we have to look at those factors?
That's a fiscal management she's
And,
talking
and,
about.
and maybe
yes.
Yeah.
just building on that, the question that we can ask you is what, in your view, is the impact of debt on the economy, on the growth of on employment, on the cost of living?
Well, where the challenge does come when we look, and we always go back to the fundamentals. If we're using a lot of the revenues that we're raising to pay debt, instead of having a situation where you have a low, like Japan, where they only have 5% of their revenues that's going to debt, then now we are of concern because we are reducing our ability to finance our budgetary needs by 40% actually going to pay debt. And that 40% is paying domestic and external debt. So it also matters how much external debt we have, because of that 40%, possibly a large proportion of that 40% is going externally, which doesn't help our country. If it's internally, that is a little bit different because it helps with liquidity and the fiscal fundamentals are a little bit
A
different
country
when it
like
comes to that.
Japan, if someone seeks health care, it will be available for literally all the citizenry. In this country, if I'm to go by what was said by Dr. Gitai of AMREF, 3 out of 10 Kenyans, all right, only 3 out of 10 are able to access what you may call reasonable health care. The others will be afraid to access health care because of the costs attached to it. That's just one statistic. If you're talking about the numbers of people who have 1 meal a day, not because of choice, but because they have no option. If you look at other economic indicators, we are doing really badly because these are the sort of things we shouldn't even be talking about.
in the first place, absolutely.
Yes.
Do you know there was one of the callers did mention, he said, we forget about what IMF, we don't care
Forget
about
it.
IMF. I don't agree with that because if something happened and we did enter into full crisis mode and we are not able to repay our debts and we're not able to finance our budget, who is going to bail us out? Who do you think we're going to call? The first person,
Those guys.
caller number one, IMF. Because
No,
that's what happened. Because
Exim
even what
Bank of
happened with
China.
Greece, what happened with Greece when they defaulted on the loan,
Yep.
the Troika came in, the European Commission, European Bank and the IMF came in to support, to lift up the economy, the Greek economy. And what did they do? They said you have to slash your budget. You have to reform your taxes, which is what we should be doing right
And
now.
they did.
And they did.
And they did.
Yes.
They had to, because if they're going to get this money, what are they? The rules are there. The conditionalities are there for the bailout. We don't want to get there. We have an opportunity to now make sure our budget is strong, make sure that we're doing program-based budgeting, which we are not, but make sure that the taxes that we're raising match the budgets that
are
we
we
are
in a crisis,
defining.
or are the people we've tasked with managing our financial matters taking us to a crisis?
We need proper management. That's definite. We have a public debt management office, which is headed by Wan Haron Sirima. He's a former central bank officer. And I'm hoping that he's going to turn around the office, because we've not had anybody. We've had people
Is
in
there
acting
political
capacity.
goodwill to ensure to have that office working?
And Wangari, can I ask, even as we put in the budget office, and much as we are very unhappy with the role of Treasury in this, Parliament is the oversight institution. They are the ones who approve the recommendations coming out from Treasury. And they have allowed us to get into this position. Is that in itself not a crisis in terms of the safeguards aren't there? The political will really, actually the problem is the governance and the political will around it. You know, the fiscal fundamentals,
also what Peter Wanyama said.
the indicators.
Our inability
It goes
to
back-
make
yeah.
rational decisions on who leads us.
It goes back to what we're
Leadership.
talking about, management, which is why I was talking about the debt management office. This whole, what's happening with the National Treasury, the different leadership that's coming in place, people are being fired, people are being brought in. That is very challenging for a country like ours who are engaging in extensive debt, looking for debt externally and internally. We need clear, strong, focused, stable leadership at the National Treasury to be able to enable us to borrow responsibly, to have a long-term vision for our borrowing, and to make sure that the borrowing that we do engage in is put in the right place.
Well,
Wangari, should we increase capital gains tax
no
and
question,
corporation
Wajiro.
tax? Just yes or no?
No.
Should we increase those taxes, capital gains and corporation tax?
If it makes sense.
Because there were proposals that were then taken off the table, and the argument is that instead of taxing the big corporations, we're going back to the Mwananchi. So should those
That's
go
a political economy thing, because, you know, who has a power to lobby and say we don't want to be taxed?
In your view, and maybe comparative to other countries, are these corporations and paying sufficient capital tax and corporation tax?
I think where it should be revisited, but the fact still remains that there's a large percentage of the economy that's not contributing to the tax.
Bas.
So we need to make sure that it's well balanced.
Wangari, thank you very much for coming. Your final comment in 30 seconds.
I would say, in order to make sure that I think to manage the debt, we need to do three things. One is to make sure that we have credible budgets, which is the most fundamental thing that a government can do. Another is that we make sure that we have good tax fundamentals, that we have an equal, fair tax that has the incidence is not unfair, and that we engage in fiscal consolidation as we are now to make sure that the current debt structure that we're in is sustainable.
Thank you very much. Wajiro Gekonyo, your final comments, and thank you very much for joining us today.
The issue is political. I think we've got good experts who are giving good advice, but we have a political problem, and that is going to continue with us. So as civil society, I think we will play our part, do the political education, and call on citizens to let their voice heard. I think we need to push back against the political impunity around the debt issue.
Let the discussion continue.
Absolutely.
Let the discussion continue.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for joining Kenya's biggest conversation this morning, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Join us again tomorrow. Eric Latif, CT Muga, Nduoko. Wajiro Gekonyo was our guest host this morning. Thank you for coming in at 5 a.m. And Wangari Muikia was our guest panelist this morning from 9 to 10. Have a good day, folks. It's 10 o'clock.